to kick off the night, Kevin Lee makes a statement with a knockout win over Gregor Gillespie. And Gillespie's a guy, I don't want to say I was pulling for him, but I like him a lot. He wrestled at Edinburgh, which is a school in northwestern Pennsylvania. So I went to Clarion University, which is actually where like Kurt Angle, Frankie Edgar, those guys went, big wrestling names. And Frankie obviously is a former 145-pound champion in the UFC. So, or former lightweight champion, 155. Man, I just thought about the fact that he was dropping down to 135, so I wanted to associate him with the weight class above. But he's dropping down to fight at a weight class that is 20 pounds lighter than than when he won the championship, which was years ago. But I mean, if you look at how hard a 20-pound jump is for guys like Weidman, who just went up and fought Dominic Reyes recently and got knocked out, like 20 pounds makes a big difference. So it's going to be interesting to see how Frankie Edgar performs at 135 pounds. I think that's probably where he should have been for a majority of his career. I mean, he's pretty small at 145. Like, look at him when he fights Jose. And Jose Aldo's dropping down to bantamweight too, if I'm not mistaken, to fight Marlon Moraes. So anyway, I just got completely fucking sidetracked. Forgot what I was talking about. Frankie Edgar, lightweight. Oh, Kevin Lee and Gregor Gillespie. I got way off track there, huh? But anyway, Gillespie is an extremely impressive wrestler. Big win over Yancy Medeiros, which was the biggest one of his career, and they face him up against Kevin Lee. And the problem with this fight is that Kevin Lee has seen a ton of high-level competition at 155 already. I didn't think it was a bad matchup, especially considering like the fact that, Kevin Lee's coming off a loss. He's had some ups and downs in his career, and he's trying to figure things out and get it sorted out. And Gillespie's a tough motherfucker, man. If he got a hold of Kevin, that was the whole question. But Kevin comes out, low stance, prepared for the takedown. Pretty much a boxing match up until Kevin turned the lights off, right? And Gregor wasn't looking terrible. I mean, I think that Kevin was winning the exchanges like a little crisper, which I thought he would on the feet. But Gillespie was popping that jab out there, landing some nice shots, staying competitive, but then he fucked up. And the timing on that head kick was incredible. I mean, Kevin Lee cracked him with the right hand. And the reason that the knockout was so devastating and, I mean, so shocking is just because, like, it's not just because of the timing on the combo. Like that right hand, when he hit Gregor with that right hand, I think it caught him by surprise. Not only did it land, but it knocked him off balance. And he was falling into the shin of Kevin Lee when it came up, and man, it turned the lights off instantly. I mean, he was out as soon as it connected. Like, you saw him go out, and then he just flew into the cage, and great win for Kevin Lee, and maybe just a little bit too much too soon for Gregor Gillespie, and maybe a wake-up call to the fact that wrestling is great if you can implement, but you got to find ways to you got to remember too is that Kevin Lee has a very strong wrestling base, right? I don't think he quite relies on it as heavily as Gregor did, but when you got someone who can defend takedowns and they're not there, and you have someone who strikes as well as Kevin Lee, you have to have really good setups and able to get in on your entries. Like, if your hands aren't threatening him in any way and he doesn't feel threatened by you on the feet, it's going to be very hard to take him down, right? Because you got to catch him off guard. You got to get him when he's not expecting it. But hats off to Kevin Lee, man. He made that change and went up and started training with Viras Sahabi at the apparently he took Joe Rogan's advice, right? Up and went up and did that, and he looked great, man. And I think that's the right place for him. I always say this about Kevin Lee, like, I think that he's going to be a champion one day. I think when you look at the skill set that he has, and just like, I also like how when he does wrestle guys and get takedowns, he's always working for the finish and always working for a path to get to a dominant position. A lot of the guys, I don't want to call it lay and pray. I don't believe, how can you, I always had a problem with that term, right? Like, people say lay and pray, but you're imposing your will on somebody else and they can't stop it. So who's doing the praying? I never understood that terminology. Anyway, Kevin Lee is a very promising prospect and somebody who had a lot of hype around him, and it kind of, fell off a little bit after his loss to Tony, and then he got tapped out by Rafael dos Anjos, and it's like, maybe he is, because if you look at, everything that he has physically, right, all the tools, he has them all, right? He just needs groomed, and it's like some decision-making and when to let off the gas and when to put it on. So, for me, this was a big win for Kevin Lee, and I'm excited to see where he goes next. If I'm the matchmaker for the UFC, Man, I think Kevin Lee wants Islam Makhachev, and I know he's lower in the rankings, but that's not a safe fight whatsoever. Another guy with a really strong wrestling base, and I would say a more varied attack on the feet than Gregor Gillespie. So Kevin Lee calling for that fight. I know that Islam is lower in the rankings, but just considering Kevin Lee's position and the guy he just fought and everything, that fight makes sense to me, right? But the problem with it is that Islam's ranked like 15th, so it doesn't do a lot to push Kevin Lee forward in the rankings, but you got to remember that he might not be looking for that. He might be looking, he's just on, he needs a path back. And Islam's no joke. I don't think he's an easier fight by any means than Gregor Gillespie. Probably harder, actually. This is one of the problems I have with rankings, right? Is that, like, in MMA, you almost have to use the eye test for everything. You can only base everything based off of what you've seen. So, man, I like that fight a lot. And I think for Kevin Lee, he's looking long term. He's looking at a steady progression through 155 pounds and not making – you don't want to make that jump too soon up into elite level competition again and not be ready for it. So I think that's a good fight. It's a solid fight, and I think it's someone who's a little better than Gregor. I'm just being – I think he just has more – not better. I don't want to say better, but he has more weapons on the feet, right? I mean, Gregor Gillespie's wrestling. If he gets a hold of you, I still think he's one of the most terrifying guys in the division. So, man. And as far as what's next for Gregor Gillespie – fuck, man, I don't really know. I'd have to have the rankings pulled up in front of me. Let me see if I can get them. Because before that loss, he was undefeated and on a real tear. What's funny is I had a name picked out before I started this podcast, and now I can't remember who the fuck it was. I'm sure once I see it, it's gonna pop out at me again. But he couldn't have fell that far in the rankings for. Alexander Hernandez might be a good fight because I know Alexander Hernandez is coming off a win. But he's ranked 14 right now. Gillespie's ranked 12. And Hernandez's most recent one was against Francisco Trinaldo. And a lot of people debated. I saw something like 11 media outlets scored the fight for Trinaldo, and I can't remember it off the top of my head to give you enough details about it. But I wouldn't mind that fight, especially because Alexander Hernandez is another explosive guy who's probably not as well-rounded as Kevin Lee. So I think that kind of evens out, and it kind of gives you a better feel for. I would say Charles Oliveira, but I'm pretty sure he fights either this weekend or next. So, yeah, I don't mind the fight with Alexander Hernandez. But the funny thing, it's funny because if you look at the rankings on the UFC website, and I don't know if they're up to date. It looks like they are. But Alexander Hernandez is actually ranked above Islam. So it would be weird for Gregor Gillespie to fight a guy who's ranked higher than the guy Kevin Lee fought. But I just don't think Gillespie's ready to fall out of top 15 competition. And I'll tell you what, man, a fight that I wouldn't mind actually seeing, and I think is Kevin Lee versus Dan Hooker. But it's going to depend on what way Kevin Lee wants to take his career. Anyway, I've been spending too much goddamn time talking about this fight, so let's move on.